1776 by David McCullough. Picture yourself on a frozen Christmas night. The wind screams past you, whipping snow and sleet that stings like angry wasps. You're shivering on a riverbank, staring at a churning mass of ice floes, and you can barely make out the far shore through the darkness. You haven't slept in what feels like forever. Your stomach is a hollow pit. And your feet? Well, let's not talk about your feet. Now here's the kicker. You're about to climb into a rickety boat, cross that nightmare of a river, and then march 9 more miles through the storm to attack trained soldiers who are currently warm, well-fed, and tucked into their beds. Sounds absolutely insane, right? Like something no reasonable person would ever agree to? But this was the razor's edge, where the American Revolution balanced in those final days of 1776. The cause of liberty wasn't just struggling anymore. By any sensible calculation, it was already dead and buried. And standing at the center of this catastrophe, a man you think you know, George Washington. Except forget the marble statue, forget the stern portrait on your money. This was a flesh-and-blood human being who was drowning in self-doubt, getting stabbed in the back by his own officers, and so completely overwhelmed that he actually wrote about wishing he could just disappear into a hut in the woods and forget this whole nightmare. Today we're exploring David McCullough's masterpiece, 1776. This isn't your dusty textbook version of history. This is a white-knuckle thriller that happens to be completely true. It sold millions of copies and won the Pulitzer Prize because McCullough does something magical. He puts you right there in that freezing river, feeling the panic, the exhaustion, and that tiny flickering flame of hope that somehow refused to die. By the time we're done today, you won't just know the facts of 1776. You'll understand what it felt like. You'll discover how a disorganized mob of farmers and shopkeepers, what their enemies mockingly called a rabble in arms, somehow found the guts to face down the most powerful empire on earth. And here's the thing. The answer isn't in clever tactics or inspiring speeches. It's in something much more fundamental. Something about human character that matters just as much today as it did back then. Our story begins not in muddy American camps, but in London, the dazzling heart of the greatest empire the world had ever seen. On a crisp autumn day in 1775, King George III rides from St. James's Palace to Westminster in an enormous golden carriage, pulled by 8 perfectly matched cream-colored horses. The thing weighs 4 tons, and when it rolls past, the ground literally shakes. 60,000 people line the streets, cheering wildly. This is the man at the absolute top of the food chain. And here's what's crucial to understand. He's not the cartoon villain we often imagine. George III was actually kind of ordinary in some ways. He preferred simple meals, hated wearing fancy wigs, and absolutely adored his wife and their 15 kids. He loved music and art. He worked hard and took his duties seriously. In his own mind, he wasn't being cruel or tyrannical. He genuinely believed he was doing the right thing. To him, the brewing trouble in America wasn't some legitimate grievance. It was a rebellion, plain and simple. A handful of troublemakers misleading good people. His job was crystal clear. Bring America back into line. His mother had always told him, "George, be a king." And that's exactly what he intended to be. Parliament mostly agreed with him. The general attitude toward Americans was somewhere between dismissive and contemptuous. One general actually bragged that he could take 5,000 British soldiers and march from one end of America to the other without breaking a sweat. There were a few voices pushing for compromise, like the brilliant Edmund Burke, but even he casually referred to America as our colonies. British supremacy wasn't up for debate. It was just how the world worked. So when the king stood before Parliament that day, he declared America in open revolt. He announced he was sending more troops, more warships, and even hiring German mercenaries called Hessians to crush the rebellion quickly. For King George, this wasn't conquest. This was discipline. Like a father dealing with a bratty child. Victory wasn't in question. It was inevitable. Now let's jump 3,000 miles across the ocean to the American camp outside Boston. The contrast couldn't be more stark. Meet George Washington. He's 43, officially the commander-in-chief of something grandly called the Continental Army. But when he looks at his troops, he doesn't see an army. He sees chaos in human form. Farmers and shopkeepers, teenagers and old guys, dressed in rags, carrying ancient muskets, with about as much discipline as a herd of cats. In a letter he never intended for public eyes, Washington pours out his despair. The reflection upon my situation and that of this army produces many an uneasy hour when all around me are wrapped in sleep. Few people know the predicament we are in. Here's the predicament. He is supposed to be laying siege to Boston, which is packed with thousands of professional British soldiers, but his army is falling apart. They have almost no gunpowder, maybe 9 shots per man, if they're lucky, no uniforms, no flag, barely any tents. The camps are filthy, and disease is ripping through them like wildfire, killing way more men than combat ever would. And the soldiers themselves? They're a commander's worst nightmare. These are fierce, independent New Englanders who volunteered to fight. But that doesn't mean they're going to follow orders they don't like. They elected their own officers, who often know as little about military matters as the guys they're supposed to be leading. Men just wander off to dig clams or head home for harvest. Washington, who comes from Virginia aristocracy and values order above almost everything, is tearing his hair out. He writes that they're exceeding dirty and nasty, and complains about their unaccountable kind of stupidity. He even admits, "Could I have foreseen what I have and am like to experience, no consideration upon earth should have induced me to accept this command." This is a man who loves precision and order, who spends his spare time designing architectural additions to his beloved Mount Vernon estate. And he's trying to build an army out of pure chaos. But wait, there's more. Most of his soldiers' enlistments expire at the end of the year. The entire army is literally going to evaporate in a few months. Everyone thought this would be a quick campaign. Washington himself told his wife Martha he'd be home by fall. But as fall turned to winter, the British sat comfortably in Boston, and the American cause seemed to be slowly freezing to death. It's right here, in this moment of near-total darkness, that we see the first spark of genius. The situation seemed impossible. The British controlled Boston and had their powerful navy protecting them. The Americans were stuck outside with no way to attack. The stalemate was bleeding the revolution dry. Washington knew he had to do something radical. The answer came from the most unlikely source imaginable. Not a veteran general, but a 25-year-old bookseller from Boston named Henry Knox. Knox was impossible to miss. 6 feet tall, 250 pounds, with a voice that could rattle windows and an infectious enthusiasm. Like Nathanael Greene, the self-taught Quaker who became Washington's most trusted general, Knox had learned military science from books. And he had an idea that was either brilliant or completely insane. Earlier, a small rebel force had captured Fort Ticonderoga, a British fort way up at Lake Champlain in upstate New York. The fort had dozens of heavy cannons and mortars just sitting there, abandoned, hundreds of miles away through wilderness. Knox told Washington he could get those cannons and haul them all the way to Boston. In winter, through the mountains, most people would have laughed him out of the room. But Washington, desperate for any solution, gave him the green light immediately. What followed was one of the great adventures of the Revolution. Knox set off in November 1775. The journey was absolutely brutal. He and his team had to move nearly 60 tons of artillery, some cannons weighing over 5,000 pounds, across frozen lakes, through deep snow, over mountains that seemed to touch the sky. They built massive sleds and rounded up 80 teams of oxen. Then there was no snow. Then everything melted into mud. Then a blizzard buried them under 3 feet of snow. When they reached the Hudson River, the ice was too thin to cross. Knox had his men cut holes in the ice, flooding the surface so it would freeze thicker. When the heaviest cannon crashed through the ice and sank to the bottom, Knox spent an entire day fishing it back out. Going down steep mountain passes, they tied ropes to trees and shoved brush under the sleds to slow their descent. Almost 300 miles of pure, stubborn determination. And by late January 1776, Knox's noble train of artillery rolled into the camp outside Boston. Not a single cannon lost. Now Washington had his weapon. His plan was as bold as Knox's journey. He would seize the high ground at Dorchester Heights, a pair of hills overlooking both Boston and the harbor. The British knew these hills were strategically vital. They'd even talked about occupying them, but in typical fashion, had done absolutely nothing. They assumed the rebels would never dare such a move. Washington was about to prove them spectacularly wrong. The problem? The ground was frozen solid. Digging trenches would be impossible, and the noise would alert the British instantly. So they came up with an ingenious solution. Build the fortifications beforehand out of timber frames, bundles of branches, and hay bales, then haul everything, including the heavy cannons, up the heights in a single night. To cover the noise, Washington ordered massive artillery bombardments from other positions for 2 nights running. The British, thinking it was just more pointless shooting, fired back enthusiastically, never realizing they were providing perfect cover for Washington's real plan. On the night of March 4th, 1776, under a full moon, the operation kicked off. 2,000 men moved silently across the narrow causeway to Dorchester, hidden behind walls of hay bales. Ox teams and wagons hauled the prefabricated fortifications and the cannons up the steep, frozen slopes. It was an absolutely phenomenal achievement. One observer wrote that perhaps never before had so much work been done in so little time. At sunrise, the British commanders looked up at the heights and literally couldn't believe what they were seeing. It was as if a fortress had materialized overnight, like something out of a fairy tale. General William Howe reportedly exclaimed, "My God, these fellows have done more work in one night than I could make my army do in 3 months." The American guns now commanded everything. The British fleet was completely exposed. The admiral sent Howe an urgent message: either remove those guns or we're leaving. Howe, who was brave and experienced, knew he had to attack. His pride demanded it. He ordered 2,000 troops to prepare for an assault. The Americans were pumped up, ready for a fight. Washington rode among them, reminding them it was the anniversary of the Boston Massacre. But then nature intervened. A massive storm hit, with hurricane-force winds and blinding snow. The British attack had to be scrubbed. And by the time the weather cleared, the American fortifications were even stronger. Howe realized an attack would be another Bunker Hill, a bloody victory he couldn't afford. He'd been completely outplayed. He had no choice but to evacuate. On March 17, 1776, the British fleet, carrying 9,000 troops and over 1,000 loyalists, sailed out of Boston Harbor. After nearly a year of siege, the city was free. It was the first major victory of the war, a stunning triumph, won not with superior numbers or firepower, but with audacity, creativity, and relentless perseverance. The news electrified the colonies. Congress ordered a gold medal struck in Washington's honor. He was the hero of the hour. But Washington wasn't celebrating. He knew this was just the opening act, and as he marched his army south toward New York, he knew the war was about to get much, much worse. The victory at Boston had been a defensive masterpiece, but in New York, Washington would make decisions that would bring him and the entire cause of independence to the absolute brink of annihilation. New York in 1776 wasn't the metropolis we know today. It was a bustling port of about 20,000 people crammed onto the southern tip of Manhattan Island. But geographically, it was a nightmare to defend. It was an island, surrounded by deep, navigable rivers. As General Charles Lee warned Washington, whoever controlled the sea would control the city. And the British absolutely controlled the sea. In early summer, the full might of the British Empire appeared in New York Harbor. It was the largest expeditionary force of the entire 18th century. Over 400 ships, including 73 warships, carrying 32,000 soldiers. A professional, superbly trained army that outnumbered the entire population of Philadelphia, America's biggest city. The forest of masts in the bay was visible for miles. To the Americans watching, it was a display of power beyond comprehension. Washington's army, on paper, had maybe 20,000 men. In reality, only about half were actually fit for duty. They were still poorly trained, poorly equipped, and riddled with sickness. So why did Washington choose to defend a place that was clearly indefensible? The decision was more political than military. Congress and the country expected him to stand and fight. Abandoning New York without firing a shot would have been a devastating blow to morale. So, against his better military judgment, he dug in. And in doing so, he made a catastrophic error. He divided his army. He kept part of his force in Manhattan and sent the other part across the East River to Long Island to defend Brooklyn Heights. He figured he could shuttle troops back and forth as needed. It was a gamble that assumed he'd control the river. It was a fatal assumption. While Washington waited, trying to guess where the blow would fall, something momentous happened in Philadelphia. On July 2nd, Congress voted to dissolve ties with Great Britain. 2 days later, they approved the final text of the Declaration of Independence. When the news reached New York, Washington had it read aloud to his troops. For the first time, they weren't fighting for their rights as Englishmen. They were fighting for a new, independent nation. That night, an exuberant mob tore down the gilded lead statue of King George III. The lead, people said, would be melted into bullets. But declarations and symbolic gestures don't win wars. On August 22nd, the British made their move. In a flawlessly executed amphibious landing, 15,000 troops went ashore at Gravesend Bay on Long Island. Unopposed, Washington, still thinking it might be a feint, sent only minimal reinforcements, leaving his Long Island force dangerously outnumbered. The American plan was to defend the heights of Gowanus, a wooded ridge between the British and the American fortifications at Brooklyn. The terrain was rough and difficult, with only a few main roads cutting through. The Americans believed the woods would neutralize the British advantage, but they made a catastrophic blunder. They left one of the passes, the Jamaica Pass on the far left, almost completely unguarded. General Henry Clinton, the shrewdest British commander, spotted this vulnerability. On the night of August 26th, he led 10,000 troops on a silent 9-mile march through the darkness, through the unguarded Jamaica Pass, and came up behind the entire American line. The Battle of Brooklyn on the morning of August 27th was a disaster. The Americans, holding their own against frontal attacks, suddenly found themselves surrounded. Attacked from front and rear, the lines collapsed. Panic spread. Men ran for their lives. Only on the right flank did any organized resistance survive. There, Lord Stirling and a few hundred men from Maryland and Delaware fought with incredible bravery, launching repeated suicidal charges against overwhelming odds to cover the retreat. Washington, watching through his telescope from Brooklyn Heights, reportedly cried out, "Good God, what brave fellows I must this day lose!" By noon it was over. The first major battle was a crushing, humiliating defeat. The Americans lost over 1,000 men, mostly prisoners, including 2 generals, and the rest of the army, about 9,000 men, were now trapped at Brooklyn with their backs to the East River and a victorious British army in front of them. The war seemed about to end. Howe just had to press his attack, or have his brother's fleet sail up the East River, and the American army would be destroyed. But Howe, perhaps haunted by the casualties at Bunker Hill, decided to halt. He'd lay siege rather than risk a frontal assault. This caution gave Washington his only chance. And what happened next borders on miraculous. For 2 days, a cold, driving northeaster kept the British fleet from moving up the river. Then, on the night of August 29th, under cover of that storm and an almost supernatural darkness, Washington executed one of the most brilliant retreats in military history. Every available boat was commandeered, and once again it was Colonel John Glover and his Marblehead mariners, the same tough fishermen and sailors who'd served at Boston, who manned the boats. In an extraordinary feat of seamanship, they ferried 9,000 men, along with horses, supplies, and cannons, across the mile-wide turbulent river in the dark, without the British ever knowing. The entire operation was conducted in absolute silence. Wagon wheels were wrapped in rags. Orders were whispered. As dawn approached, a large part of the army was still waiting to cross. Discovery seemed certain. Then came an incredible stroke of luck. A heavy fog settled over Brooklyn, concealing the final stages of the retreat, while the New York side remained perfectly clear. When the British finally advanced in the morning, they found the American lines empty. The army had vanished like ghosts. It was an incredible escape that saved the army from annihilation. But it was still a retreat. They'd been outmaneuvered, outfought, and driven from Long Island. And now they faced the inevitable. They couldn't hold New York. The following weeks were pure nightmare. The army that had been so full of hope was now drowning in despair. Confidence shattered. Soldiers deserted by the hundreds. Entire militia units just packed up and went home. On September 15th, the British struck again. Under cover of a devastating naval bombardment at Kipps Bay, they landed on Manhattan. The American militia there, green troops who'd never faced such terrifying firepower, broke and ran without firing a shot. Washington, racing to the scene, found his men flying in every direction. He exploded with rage. He cursed them, struck at them with his riding crop, and in his fury rode to within 100 yards of the enemy, seemingly ready to die right there, before his aides could grab his horse and drag him away. The British took New York City easily. The American army was in full panicked retreat up Manhattan. The final collapse seemed at hand. But the next day, in a small but vicious fight at Harlem Heights, a group of American Rangers fought back with surprising ferocity, driving a superior British force into retreat. It was a small victory, but psychologically enormous. It proved Americans could stand and fight, that the Redcoats weren't invincible. It was a desperately needed shot of courage. For the next month, the armies faced each other in tense standoff. But Washington knew he couldn't stay. Howe could outflank him at any time. So the long retreat began again. Washington moved north into Westchester County, abandoning all of Manhattan except Fort Washington, a fortification high above the Hudson where he left a garrison. The decision to leave troops at Fort Washington was another terrible blunder, born of indecision and misguided optimism from Nathanael Greene. On November 16th, the fort was attacked by a vastly superior force of British and Hessian troops. After a few brutal hours, the fort surrendered. Nearly 3,000 American soldiers were captured. It was the most devastating blow of the war, costing Washington nearly a quarter of his army. Watching from across the river, Washington reportedly wept. Now the retreat turned desperate. With the aggressive General Cornwallis in hot pursuit, Washington led his dwindling army across New Jersey. It was a, quote, long retreat, a desperate flight for survival. The men were in rags, many without shoes, leaving bloody footprints in the frozen mud. The army was melting away. By the time Washington reached the Delaware River in early December, his army numbered fewer than 3,000 men. As Nathanael Greene wrote, it was a very pitiful army to trust the liberties of America on. Across New Jersey, people gave up. Thousands flocked to the British to swear allegiance to the king. The cause seemed finished. In Philadelphia, Congress panicked, abandoned the city, and fled to Baltimore. Washington managed to get his army across the Delaware, seizing every boat to prevent British pursuit, but he knew it was only temporary. As soon as the river froze solid, the British could walk across and finish him. "I think the game is pretty near up," he wrote in a moment of utter despair. Here, at the absolute lowest point of the war, with everything on the line, our story reaches its climax. The British, confident the rebellion was crushed, went into winter quarters, establishing outposts across New Jersey. The post at Trenton was held by 1,500 Hessians, professional soldiers who held American rebels in utter contempt. Washington knew he had to do something. One last, desperate gamble. He would cross the Delaware and attack Trenton. It was a plan born of what he called dire necessity. And so we return to that storm-tossed Christmas night. Washington and his 2,400 men cross the ice-choked river in a howling northeaster. The crossing takes hours longer than planned. They're soaked, freezing, exhausted. They march 9 miles through snow and sleet in the dark. Their guns are so wet they might not fire. Washington's orders are simple. Use the bayonet. They reach Trenton at 8 in the morning, an hour after daylight, their hopes of a surprise night attack gone. But the storm that hampered them also provided cover. The Hessians are completely unprepared. The battle is short and savage. Knox's artillery sweeps the main streets. The Americans, who'd been running for months, now charge with fury born of desperation. The Hessians, caught by surprise and surrounded, are overwhelmed. Within 45 minutes, it's over. Nearly 900 Hessians captured. Incredibly, not a single American killed in combat. Washington and his men recrossed the Delaware with their prisoners, having marched and fought for nearly 36 hours straight in unimaginable conditions. The victory at Trenton was more than military. It was a thunderclap of hope that electrified the country. The news spread through the colonies, reviving the dying spirit of revolution. It proved the Army hadn't been beaten, that Washington was still a force to be reckoned with, that the cause wasn't lost. Days later, Washington would cross again and defeat a British force at Princeton. In 10 days, he'd completely turned the tables, driven the British from most of New Jersey, and saved the American Revolution. The campaign of 1776, a year of almost unrelenting defeat and despair, ended with two of the most astonishing, unlikely victories in American history. When you look back at 1776, it's tempting to see it as inevitable, a story with a known happy ending. But as McCullough so powerfully shows, for the people living through it, the outcome was anything but certain. For most of that year, the American cause was circling the drain. So what's the real takeaway from 1776? What can we, living in such a different world, learn from this story? I think the answer isn't in the grand declarations or political debates. It's in the character of the people who endured. It's about perseverance. About what happens when you refuse to quit, even when everything and everyone is screaming that you've already lost. Think about Washington. This book shows him not as a flawless icon, but as a deeply human leader wrestling with doubt and frustration. He made mistakes, serious ones. His decision to defend New York was a strategic blunder that nearly cost everything. His indecision over Fort Washington led to catastrophe. He himself admitted he wasn't equal to the command. And yet he held it together. He learned from his mistakes. He bore the weight of defeats, desertions, and betrayals with fortitude that's almost incomprehensible. When everything was falling apart, he was the one who didn't break. As Nathaniel Greene observed, Washington never appeared to such advantage as in the hour of distress. Think about the ordinary soldiers. The men who left their farms and families, who marched for months in rags, who slept in mud and snow, who faced the best army in the world with little more than courage. Men like Joseph Hodgkins, who after learning of his young son's death, still wrote to his wife that he must stay because the cause demanded it. These weren't summer soldiers or sunshine patriots, as Thomas Paine called them. They were the ones who stood when it mattered most. The story of 1776 teaches us that history isn't made by impersonal forces. It's made by people, by their courage, their mistakes, their resilience, and their refusal to quit. The victories at Trenton and Princeton weren't just tactical successes. They were triumphs of the human spirit, proof that a small group of determined people, led by someone who won't quit, can change the course of history. So how does this apply to you? How does a story from so long ago matter today? First, it's a powerful reminder that the hardest times often forge the greatest strength. Washington became the leader we remember not in easy times, but in the crucible of the long retreat. When you face your own dark hours, remember these are the moments that define you. Second, it's a lesson in the power of the brilliant stroke. For months, Washington's army was purely defensive, just trying to survive. But he never stopped watching for an opportunity, no matter how small, to strike back. He knew one bold, unexpected move could change everything. In your own life, when you feel overwhelmed or defensive, don't just endure. Look for your Trenton. Look for that one place where a small, courageous action can create a turning point. That was a summary of 1776 by David McCullough. We've covered the main events today, but here's the truth. A summary can only show you the map. The real magic happens when you walk the ground yourself. It's in the quiet moments when a particular story, or a simple phrase from McCullough's writing, hits you in a way you didn't expect. This overview is designed to help you decide if this book deserves your time. If anything we've talked about today stirred something in you, if you felt even a flicker of the fear, desperation, or incredible courage of that year, then please grab a copy. Reading it isn't just about learning history. It's an experience that can genuinely change how you think about leadership, perseverance, and the foundations of this country. Also, if you found this summary valuable and it sparked your curiosity, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe to the channel. That way you won't miss our next journey into another life-changing book from the billionaire's bookshelf. Let's keep learning and growing together.